Welcome everybody to this second in our series of webinars on particular volumes in the Cambridge Texts in the History of Political Thought series. The series that I still think of as the blue series, with the red writing on the front. Here's Kant, he's the only one I have at home, but all my other ones are at work. But yeah, here he is. In what has become a kind of iconic series, an iconic staple of student life. The covers have changed; they're much more illustrated now, but they still wear their very handsome red and blue livery, and are foundational to the discipline. One of the founding intentions of the series was nothing less, and I'm quoting here, to make available to students all the most important texts in the history of political thought. And part of what that meant from the beginning was thinking and rethinking and challenging what was important, what were the most important texts. And so Quentin Skinner, who is the founder of this series and still a guiding light in it, his ambition was always to expand and enlarge and rethink the canon and incorporate less well-known works into the pantheon of so-called great thinkers. And this is a project that the series is engaged with in an ongoing way, pushing ever further the horizon of the canon. And now the series aspires to be ever more global and to bring in marginalized voices. And it's in that context that I'm delighted that we can talk today about this relatively new volume that came out in 2022, which is W.E.B. Du Bois's International Thought. And it's edited by Adom, Getachew and Jennifer Pitts. And I'm so happy and lucky that you're here to talk about it with us. It's an amazing volume, Adom and Jennifer, with a completely stunning introduction. So congratulations. We're going to start the webinar with a little introduction, a little biographical introduction on Du Bois, and then we're going to have a reading from one of the most amazing passages in it, and then we're going to have a conversation about his arguments, and then we'll open the floor and take questions from you. And end the discussion that way. But before we get into talking about Du Bois, let me introduce the panelists, the editors of this amazing edition, the dazzling and distinguished scholars on your screen. Adom Getachew is Professor of Political Science and Race, Diaspora and Indigeneity at the University of Chicago. She works on intellectual and political histories of Africa and the Caribbean. She's the author of a world-making book, which is called World Making After Empire, The Rise and Fall of Self-Determination, and is now writing a book on Garveyism. And Jennifer Pitts also works at the University of Chicago, where she's Professor of Political Science and the Committee on Social Thought. And Jennifer works on modern political and international thought, and her books include A Turn to Empire, The Rise of Imperial Liberalism in Britain and France, and The Boundaries of the International. So welcome, Adom and Jennifer. And actually it's a sort of wonderful conjunction, because not only are you both employed at the University of Chicago, but Adom is on the editorial board of the Blue series, and Jennifer is a co-editor of the kind of twin series published by Cambridge University Press, which is the also iconic Ideas in Context series. So we've got a lot of Cambridge University Press power in this room. I believe, Adom, you're going to begin by talking to us a little bit about Du Bois's biography.
Yeah, great. First, thanks, Hannah, for the introduction, and Cambridge University Press for publishing the book and putting together this event, and everyone for joining us from wherever you are. Yeah, so just give a broad overview of Du Bois's life. It's a long and storied life, so he'll be very brief, but Du Bois was born in 1868, 3 years after the end of the American Civil War in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. So in various ways, I think it's important that his life begins outside of the kind of scene of slavery, of the U.S. South, but importantly, that becomes the space for his earliest intellectual and political development. He attends Fisk University as an undergraduate, and this becomes his first and very important set of encounters with the U.S. South, with the kind of end and crisis of Reconstruction. That would be a very important theme throughout his life, beginning in his earliest essays, but also continuing up until his magnum opus, the 1935 Black Reconstruction. I think the other thing about his early life we want to highlight, and the volume makes clear, is that actually his engagements with internationalism begin quite early. So, as an undergraduate, he gives a lecture on Bismarck. He's educated at the University of Berlin, where he begins to encounter both German Romanticism and European socialism. But so much of our volume really focuses, well, there's a few essays from the early 20th century, really the formative moment in which international themes, the question of empire, comes to the foreground, is around World War I. And Jennifer will soon read one of those early essays. And this question about, I think, the international for Du Bois is always deeply connected to his own positioning as an American thinker, as an African-American thinker. So I think one of the things we've been very interested in is how he thinks the question of race in the United States in the context of and in relation to wider questions of empire and the international order. And this continues to be a kind of persistent theme for him, showing up in different ways throughout his career. He near the end, he ends his life, the last couple of years of his life in Ghana. He passes away in 1963. And I think in many ways, the arc of his life from Great Barrington to Fisk, through Europe and then finally culminating in Ghana, in various ways shows the kind of the ways he had some multiple both life trajectories, but intellectual and political itineraries that intersected at various moments and departed in other moments. And we hope that the essays kind of read together illustrate and illuminate those moments. And we can talk more about this later, but I think one of the upshots of a volume of essays is that you get to see both the ways in which particular moments of political crisis generate new thinking, and you can track the kind of the central preoccupations of Du Bois's thinking, which for us really center on this question of what is the relationship, or how does he pose the relationship between democracy and empire. And so with that, I'll just turn it over to Jennifer.
Okay, great, thank you. And I want to echo Adom's thanks to Cambridge Press and to Hannah for bringing us together for this conversation. So as Adom said, the reading that we chose to start the conversation with is from one of his World War I essays. It's from The African Roots of War, which was published in 1915 in the Atlantic Monthly. And in certain ways, it's a kind of core piece for the volume. And in the piece, Du Bois argues that while it's widely assumed that Africa is far afield from the concerns of the modern world and particularly the terrible problem of world war. In fact, the roots of the current war and the menace of future wars lie in Africa. So I'm going to read two brief passages from the essay, one that diagnoses the problem that Du Bois calls democratic despotism, and then one that begins to articulate his alternative vision of democracy. So it is no longer simply the merchant prince or the aristocratic monopoly or even the employing class that is exploiting the world. It is the nation, a new democratic nation composed of united capital and labor. The laborers are not yet getting, to be sure, as large a share as they want or will get, and there are still at the bottom large and restless excluded classes. But the laborer's equity is recognized, and his just share is a matter of time, intelligence, and skillful negotiation. Such nations it is that rule the modern world. Their national bond is no mere sentimental patriotism, loyalty, or ancestor worship. It has increased wealth, power, and luxury for all classes on a scale the world never saw before. Never before was the average citizen of England, France, and Germany so rich with such splendid prospects of greater riches. Whence comes this new wealth, and on what does its accumulation depend? It comes primarily from the darker nations of the world, Asia and Africa, South and Central America, the West Indies, and the islands of the South Seas. So that's the diagnosis portion. Then just skipping ahead a little, we then who want peace must remove the real causes of war. We have extended gradually our conception of democracy beyond our social class to all social classes in our nation. We have gone further and extended our democratic ideals not simply to all classes of our own nation, but to those of other nations of our blood and lineage, to what we call European civilization. If we want real peace and lasting culture, however, we must go further. We must extend the democratic ideal to the yellow, brown, and black peoples. To say this is to evoke on the faces of modern men a look of blank hopelessness. Impossible, we are told. Impossible? Democracy is a method of doing the impossible. It is the only method yet discovered of making the education and development of all men a matter of all men's desperate desire. It is putting firearms in the hands of a child with the object of compelling the child's neighbors to teach him not only the real and legitimate uses of a dangerous tool, but the uses of himself in all things. Are there other and less costly ways of accomplishing this? There may be in some better world, but for a world just emerging from the rough chains of an almost universal poverty and faced by the temptation of luxury and indulgence through the enslaving of defenseless men, there's but one adequate method of salvation, the giving of democratic weapons of self-defense to the defenseless.
Brilliant, brilliant. Thank you. Thank you both for those fantastic introductions, and what amazing passages. Before we get on to the second part that you read, Jennifer, which is the moment of hope, the idea of democracy being a method of doing the impossible, which is such a compelling idea. Let's go back to the diagnosis of the problem and to exactly his account of what he calls democratic despotism, and this sort of contradictory state of affairs, which he sees as at the core of the condition of the world in the 20th century, whereby you have democratic nations who are thriving and becoming rich on the basis of their despotic domination and exploitation of what we would now perhaps want to call the global south. And obviously he has an account of race and of the color line that he says tethers the world. So there's this triad that he lays out between democracy, despotism, and race. And I wonder if you want to unpack that further for us.
Yeah, I can start, and then maybe Jennifer can pick up. You know, I think one thing about this particular essay, which is, I think it's the first time he articulates this argument, and the democratic despotism language itself doesn't appear in other contexts, but versions of this particular idea do appear. So one thing I think that's important about this essay is it's trying to say that there's something very specific about what others might call the new imperialism, or the kind of moment of the scramble for Africa, the late 19th century imperial expansion. So he wants to make the case that we have to understand this as a distinctive kind of moment in the project of European empire. And that what makes it distinct is that it arrives, he argues, in a moment of greater democratization, right? Both political, and he suggests to some extent social democracy too, that the rights of labor, and this is a moment in which democracy is being expanded from a specifically political to a more social sense of the term. So there's this attempt, I think, very importantly, to diagnose this as a phase or a particular instantiation of empire. I think the second part is that, part of this diagnosis stems both as much, it's drawn as much from what he's observing in the United States as what he's observing globally, right? So whereas the global story is one in which this process of democratization and incorporation of labor into political and some social rights is occurring on the backs of the colonized. It's a pattern he's much more actually familiar with from the United States, right? And this essay comes in, it's a very early essay from 1915, but this, he'll write in the coming years about the precise ways in which labor organizations in the United States exclude African-American workers and, become the sites of very intense forms of racial conflict and racial violence. East St. Louis is his primary example in that case. But I think what's important about this diagnosis is that in attending to the historical specificity, the conditions under which this particular conjunction happens, he makes room for the possibility that democracy itself is not a bankrupt political project, right? And the question for him here, and the question for him in other works, say in Black Reconstruction, for instance, is what are the precise conditions in which say a white working class or a metropolitan working class comes to align itself with capital and against kind of Black working classes. And that for him is really a political question and a historical question rather than a kind of, essential logic of the way race works.
Is it part of the essential logic of global capitalism? Yeah.
Yes, I think he would argue that it is essential to capitalism, and so his vision for his sort of alternative democratic vision is very emphatically an anti-capitalist one. Yeah. So there's the argument about the roots of capitalism lying in the slave trade. So he's telling a long story going back to it's a continuous story going back to the origins of the modern European imperial order. And in that sense, it's a bit different from some other socialists of the period who are identifying, the moment of finance capitalism as a decisive turn away from a longer history. For Du Bois, the history is very continuous. As Adom said, it is a particular moment of democratic domination, but it's entwined in a very continuous story that starts with the slave trade, the inordinate profits of the slave trade, then kind of jumpstart European industrialization, fuel European investments in empire, and launch a history of racialized labor regimes that don't end with abolition, that get transformed in various ways with abolition. And one of the preoccupations of a lot of the essays in the volume is to track the various ways in which the imperial control of land and labor morphs over time from slavery to, there are reconstructions of a kind of importation of the plantation system into East Africa and South Africa, into the Congo in Belgium. But he's also interested in the ways in which capitalism and capital in conjunction with the imperial state commandeers the land and labor of what he calls the darker nations of the world, sometimes outside formal empire, sometimes through formal empire, but in protean ways. And yeah, go ahead, Hannah.
No, that's fantastic. Yes, so exactly as both of you have been saying, there's a way in which he's interested in thinking about despotism, both in a kind of, obvious imperial sense, but also in terms of despotism at home and how you can have democracy and despotism in America. And so, I mean, I wonder, one sort of trajectory we could take here is to think about the categories of the national and the international, and to think, of course, about kind of migration stories and forced migration, maybe all, and whether, what he does, what he helps us see about the kind of porosity between those categories, and what merit those categories still have, what the international space is, whether it's an inherently despotic space. I don't know if either of you want to talk to that.
Yeah, I want to say one thing about despotism itself in his thinking, both in the in the domestic and the international. So on the one hand, he uses this to describe, as we've talked about, this very specific relationship between the metropole and the democratizing metropole and the colonized periphery. But I think one of the things about the ways he uses despotism is that he also thinks about it as a kind of moral psychological, that there's a moral psychology to it. So part of what he's tracking is the ways in which, especially again, I think the United States is really interesting in this sense because of the ways in which the kind of metropole and colony parts of that democratic despotism are not spatially segregated or differentiated. They're happening in very intimate and proximate relationship to each other. So it becomes a space for him to really think through what are the habits, how, he will say later, democracy is a habit, right? Well, despotism is also a habit. There are ways in which one comes to be habituated into structures of domination and to understand oneself as superior, right? And to, and I think the 1920 volume Dark Water and the essay Souls of White Folk is really powerful on this point about how it is that one comes to embody a sense of white supremacy. So I think that's really important. The other thing I would say about the despotism point also is that even as he's attentive to the kind of layers of it, its institutional, structural dynamics, its kind of everyday habits, it also seems very important to him that it's a necessarily unstable, formation. And part of, in other essays, he's very interested in trying to think through how might it be that this conjunction might be disentangled, right? How might democracy be undone from its, despotic instantiation? But on the question of the international as is it a necessarily despotic sphere? I don't think he would say that. And I think part of his picture of the international is that it's not only a space occupied by states, right? The international is not an interstate space. And it is a space in which, as important, it's about empires, it's structured by empires. And there's another essay in the volume called Worlds of Color, which is a really stunning thinking through about, using the metaphor of shadows, very familiar from his domestic writings, about how to think about the kind of the international as the space of doubles and of empires and their shadows. But it's also equally a space for him for organizing, articulating counter-hegemonic projects like the Union of Color or Pan-Africanism.
Absolutely, yes. Jennifer, do you want to?
Yeah, just a couple things to add on the point about the international not being just made up of states. I think, the kinds of solidarities that Adom just referred to are undoubtedly the most important for him. But I think it's also interesting that he took advantage of the existence of the new international institutions, in which he did not have a huge amount of hope, but he saw them as an opportunity to make the case for rights for African Americans as minority rights, as he did in 1918 in the lead up to the foundation of the League of Nations, and then in the appeal to the world after World War II in the foundation of the UN. Again, he's making the case to an international body, and he's arguing with the leaders of the human rights body in the UN, who are saying, no, it's only states that can bring human rights concerns to the UN, and he's making the case that there are international actors other than states that should have a place at the table. This is maybe to go back to an earlier question of yours, Hannah, but you were asking about, is capitalism inevitably, does it inevitably involve racial domination? And one theme that works its way through essays in the volume is alternative forms of economic self-organization that he thinks can be pioneered partly by African Americans, partly because of their exclusion from or subordinated position within the capitalist order. He is envisioning forms of cooperative economics that are driven not by the profit motive, but by the ideal of service, he says, and that take advantage of institutions within the Black community, churches, Black lawyers, and so he's thinking of, so he's looking to, he sees the compromise that the white working class has made, or the capitulation that the white working class has made to the capitalist order as in certain ways catastrophic for the white working class as a giving up of their own democratic possibilities and of industrial democracy, of the opportunity to actually have democratic control over the economic conditions of their lives. And so he's thinking about alternative forms of democracy that involve really an alternative economic system to capitalism.
Yes, yes. As you're talking, and also thinking back to what Adom just said about habit, democracy as habit, and in relation to thinking about his approach to international institutions, I was wondering about his approach to human rights as a kind of a resource for hope, and because he does have that essay that an appeal to the world, a statement of the denial of human rights to minorities, and it seems like he's fully in favor of them there. But exactly as Adom was saying, there's this very sort of thick and rich account of the psychology of oppression and the ways in which one might nominally have rights, and yet in order to understand what oppression is and how it works, we have to think far beyond what, as it were, one has guaranteed in law, and that, that we're constrained in all sorts of hegemonic ways, in all sorts of structural ways, and that our choices, our desires, our preferences are deeply shaped in ways that human rights discourse can't perhaps capture, that liberal discourse can't capture. And I wonder if you see him as a sort of critic of that, as much as interested in the resources it might nonetheless offer in terms of, as it were, diplomacy and persuasion and rhetoric.
I think that is right. And I think part of one way to read the appeal to the world, and more generally these moments where he seeks to elevate the kind of question of African American citizenship onto a global stage, is that it's as much about it seems to me it's as much about trying to use the instruments that are available, right, to and to kind of but it's also about recasting the question of race in America. So, and he does this very frequently about transforming what is a kind of a national minority, a domestic minority, into a kind of global majority, right? So the idea is that if we looked at from this vantage point, from the, from within the UN, we are actually a kind of global majority, not a minority. And that seems to me as much about kind of recasting and transforming a kind of ongoing project that Du Bois, many others have, about recasting the ways African Americans view themselves in relation to kind of a global color line, right? That kind of transforms the kind of the demographic relationship, at least in the country. And I think that, yeah, this question about habits also seems to me like around the cooperatives, for instance, as important as the cooperatives are as an alternative form of economic organization, they're also site things in which people develop new ways of understanding themselves. They come to value different things, right? They're oriented towards different aspirations, different goals. So I think one of the things that's remarkable about Du Bois is his ability to think at so many scales simultaneously, right? So at this very kind of on the ground level about like, how do individuals come to embody something like a democratic politics, but also simultaneously thinking about what are the kind of international infrastructures and institutions that exist, and how might they be transformed to kind of embody and or to further this aspiration for a kind of universalizing democracy.
Yes. Jennifer, do you want to add anything?
No, I don't think so at the moment. I think.
Yes, as you're so right about the kind of multi-layeredness of the texts and the way that he's sort of opening up things almost. He was sort of always opening up things, sometimes in kind of contradictory directions, but nonetheless they kind of come full circle. So thinking about this approach to rights from the point of view of the global majority, obviously rights, we think of rights as this refuge for minorities, and to do that, to make that kind of circle, it's part of it is part of the kind of often the sort of magical moments in the text. And so should we turn then to think about hope and to the project of democracy and self-government, and I think it's important to note, for those who haven't yet read this amazing volume, how extraordinary his language is, and the work that in itself does as part of the kind of transformative exercise that he's engaged in. And there's that amazing bit in The Worlds of Color in 1925 when he's talking about his ship seeking Africa, and he describes sailing across the Atlantic to the Canaries and then turning and seeking that, and he says, that mighty and fateful shoulder of gigantic Africa, and getting to Liberia and saying that it's a little thing set upon a hill, and it only has 2 million folk in it, but to me it represents the world. Such an amazing moment, and quite resonant now. Anyway, such an amazing moment. Yeah, and so I wonder if you want to talk about the kind of power of the language as part of his kind of project for hope, because there's no, it's not as we've kind of already intimated, it's not by any means straightforward hope. It's full of challenge. It's full of the kind of sensitivity towards the way in which projects can be kind of be pulled back by the tide just at the moment where they seem to be, crashing onto the shore or whatever. So, yeah, do you want to talk about hope and the impossibility of democracy?
There's so much to say there. I'll just say two things to start. One is his experimental relation to language and the way that he works out ideas. So we talk about this in relation to the essay form, that it's kind of inherently experimental form, and he's trying out ideas, and there are continuities of preoccupations over his extraordinarily long career, but he's also trying out ideas and in response to particular political conjunctures and crises, as Adom said earlier. He's also thinking in multiple genres. I mean, he's thinking through autobiography. The moment that you described is an autobiographical moment. I would say his international writings are maybe less thoroughly autobiographical than something like Souls, where there are more, the autobiographical chapters are woven throughout that work. But he's also thinking through the novel form. the novel Dark Princess is 1928 is a particularly important space in which he works through his ideas about what global South, let's call it, solidarity would look like. It's also a place where he's thinking through the role of gender, the centrality of the female protagonist, who's an Indian woman who encounters the African American male protagonist, and the sort of collab. She stands at the nexus of a kind of global revolutionary collaboration, and gender is not a particularly prominent theme in his international writings otherwise, but that's the space in which he's using the genre of fiction to the genre of the novel to think through some of those themes. And this is a separate issue, but the emotional force that Liberia had for him, and the case of Liberia as just a tremendously important one through which he thinks a lot of these problems. And I think it's no accident that some of his most poetic moments are in relation to Liberia. He talks about Liberia. We think of Liberia as a self-steered craft, but in fact, it's been tossed upon the waves of global capitalism. And he uses very evocative language in relation to Liberia, and it's a case that he uses to think about. He's got it, and this relates to your question about hope. The hope he hasn't, although he's a profound critic of the European nation state as the kind of tip of the iceberg of the European imperial structure, and as deeply the nation state as constituted in Europe is not a form that embodies hope or aspiration, but he remains attached to something like the vision of the self-governing nation, and I think it's in relation to Liberia in particular that he articulates that hope, and laments the vulnerabilities of that he sees that Liberia. He uses Liberia to talk about the ways in which the independent post-colonial nation is utterly threatened and vulnerable by the ongoing forces of imperial capital. So Liberia is a space that helps him do a lot of his most important, I think, theoretical work around these questions of the international order.
Thank you. Adom, do you want to?
No, I think that covers it.
No,
yeah.
I could go in so many directions. I mean, when you were talking, Jennifer, about gender and the princess, and I was thinking a sort of kind of tension, or a way in which his account is a sort of thick account that goes in many different directions, is in relation to his account of race, and sometimes wanting to think in terms of ethnicity and of blood and of maternity and birth, and then sometimes wanting to think in terms of very much and very strongly in terms of construction, and critical race theory, and I wonder, and I wonder if there's a kind of journey that he goes on in the course of the writings in relation to that, and whether you'd like to speak, to the question of his treatment of color, as to use his word.
Yeah, this is oh, go ahead, Jennifer.
I was just going to say he wrote about the color line. He wrote of the color line that it was both a problem and answer. Yeah, and he wrote about the races being pounded together into new political solidarity. So that's very much a constructivist. It's an idea that there are disparate peoples that have been subjected through this global system of white supremacy and empire, subjected in having a shared experience of subordination under white supremacy, such that they are put in a position to generate new political solidarities, and that's so the color line, having been the problem, can be the solution to the problem that it is. So I think there are debates about to what extent Du Bois in his early writings, sort of pre-1900 writings, had a more essentialist notion of race. I think even in the essays of the 1890s, the conservation of races, you can see a constructivist approach to race throughout. But I think certainly in from the point at which the essays in the volume start, the view of the color, the color line is a political phenomenon and a phenomenon of racial psychology, of white supremacy, as Adom was saying, and not so racial essentialism doesn't enter, I think, into the picture of the global color line as it's articulated in these essays. Adom, do you want to?
Yeah, I was just adding 2 points. The image cover of the book is taken from the 1900, these illustrations of visual data maps that Du Bois and his students prepared for the 1900 Paris exposition. And our cover is blue washed, so you can't see this, but if you look up the image, it basically, I think, encases the world in skin. It presents a kind of complected world and tries to show, by just the distribution of Black people, but the map is colored to reflect the color line. And I think one of the things that's really interesting about that is how, it's showing the kind of movement of people in the transatlantic slave trade. And there's both a sense in which these thin lines of documenting the movement of peoples both connects Africa and America, but yet these lines are so thin, so fragile and tenuous. And I think there's a way that Du Bois is constantly interested in that tenuous connection that is more than kind of just political coordination. This comes up, for instance, when in the moments he refers to his grandmother as lullabies, as the kind of fragmented connection he directly has to Africa. And I think I agree with Jennifer. I think the focus and emphasis on the color line is this, the sense of a shared political and historical experience that constitutes the basis for political action. There seems to be the moments in which he, I think actually in moments of maybe political crisis or failure, he reverts back to a kind of romance of race. So it's striking that the kind of the Dark Princess, which is the novel we talked about, it's a romance between an Indian woman and African American that produces this child, and the child is supposed to be the kind of embodiment of this new project of of race coordination, literally embodied in the birth of this child. And I think there's a way in which romance becomes a site for imagining the thing that is difficult in practice, right? Or when he hits upon the limits and contradictions of his various efforts at these Pan-African projects, there's a sense of trying to fall back on these a thicker sense, say, of kind of race. But I think there's one reading of Du Bois which would say something like, he starts off with the conservation of races, and then he ends up at Dusk of Dawn, where he basically says a Black person is the person who's made to sit at the back of the Jim Crow car. And, and that's the basis of kind of what race is and what racial solidarity is. And I think, I do think you see that latter social constructed view of race becoming much more prominent over time. But I think there's always a way in which both are simultaneously present and emphasized at different moments in different texts and for different kinds of purposes also.
Yes, wonderful. Gosh, there's so much more I want to ask you about, but I feel like we need to listen to the questions, but there are more questions that I could ask. But let's now turn to the questions from the audience. So I'm going to read the first question out. Du Bois is credited with acknowledging the talented tenth as a kind of elite theory, a la Mosca, Pareto, Michels, which raises interesting questions about reconciling his social recognition of elites with his aspiration to spread democracy. I don't know if either of you have anything you want to say about that.
Jennifer, do you want to?
I mean, one way to take up the talented tenth question in relation to his international writings is to think about the way in which he talks about African American leadership of the darker nations of the world, and how his view about that shifts over time. So early on, there's a moment around the Spanish-American War when he imagines that the incorporation of all of these new conquered territories will both, will provide an opportunity for the African American community to be a leader of these other newly colonized nations, but also a kind of transformation of the country into a more multiracial and possibly democratic body. But over time, he comes to perceive leadership in other parts of the world, to see India as a source of leadership, and African Americans as learning techniques of organization and resistance from elsewhere in the global South. So that's not really a direct answer. I mean, I could take up the question of the talented tenth more directly. I think it's not contradictory to his view about to his advocacy of democracy, in the sense that part of the argument is for the education of teachers that you can't have a democratic movement without education, and so you have to teach the teachers in order to educate the larger population. But I'll stop there, and Adom may have more questions.
No, I think yeah, let's move on, because I think there's a few other questions.
So the next question about AI, why we are being increasingly pushed in the age of technological despotism with artificial intelligence, the new forms of capital taking shape in this age. Even a state is vulnerable to such forms of capital. How do you think in this age we should reimagine Du Bois? I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not sure if, I'm sure there are many other people who have more direct things to say about AI and technological domination. But I think, part of hopefully what's useful about the volume to folks is thinking about, contemporary questions is maybe less about how Du Bois might be directly applicable or directly, related to a question like artificial intelligence, but are there ways of posing questions and that he provides? And I think we've talked a little bit about a few of them here, like thinking constantly around, thinking together the international and the domestic, thinking in a scalar way about, or concentric circles way about different levels of analysis and different way and thinking about where they intersect, how they reproduce each other, where they might come apart. And I think that's the third thing about Du Bois's thinking that I think is really, he's a political thinker, and so he's always interested in these questions about where are the sites of critical and political intervention, right? And how and what are the kind of languages of disclosure, political strategies that can make those kinds of interventions. And so it's not directly about AI, but I think there's a way that we might think of him as a kind of exemplary political thinker who offers, ways of posing questions, and yeah, that and his, again, we've talked about this kind of experimental approach of trying and retrying to look at the same thing from multiple vantage points, that I think are just important lessons for approaching any political question.
Yes. As you're talking, Adom, I was thinking, he's a political thinker in a way, insofar as he's a deeply historical thinker. I mean, something that we didn't talk about particularly in the discussion, but which I found so amazing about him is that it's through this sort of historical analysis that he comes, or that his historical analysis is irrevocably normative in its kind of conclusions. So, to learn the history of Africa is to come to a particular kind of evaluative viewpoint about its fantastic history and, the appalling exploitation. So I don't know. I think the way in which he brings history in, and makes history central to his political thinking, is amazing, and good for us who are very interested in the history of political thought. Anyway, sorry. So yes. So the next question is about the Bolshevik Revolution. That's right. So what can you tell us what Du Bois had to say about the Bolshevik Revolution? As you talk about in your edition, he develops a sort of studied blindness, I think you call it, in relation to Soviet authoritarianism, Stalinist authoritarianism. And I wonder if you want to talk about that. And also, it raises the question about what it's like to edit, like what special insights occur to the editor when. So obviously, how did you navigate this Soviet sympathy? But what special insights come to the editor when you're reading exactly, something, that might be sort of hard for us, to come cold to, but nonetheless you kind of found a way of understanding it in a way that you wouldn't necessarily have come to had you not been editing the work?
Well, let me just say one thing to start us off, which is, after the Bolshevik Revolution, Du Bois had been in Paris around the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. This is the moment of the first Pan-African Congress, his first attempt to try and intervene in the space of formal international politics vis-a-vis the League. And he comes back and writes this really incredible editorial in the Crisis. It's not in the volume, but in which he comes to the conclusion that the only good thing that came out of this war is the Bolshevik Revolution. And what that inspires for him is, this sense that, the laborers can be self-governing, right? That this is a kind of worker democracy, an experiment in kind of in democratic, in this attempt to do the thing he says in the African Roots of War, give arms to the young and help them educate themselves. He says it's going to be an experiment. And I do think there's part of him that holds on to that for a long time. There's a manuscript in his archive from the 50s called Russia and America that was never published. It was rejected by the publisher for its overly sympathetic view of the Soviet Union, and there's some very interesting back and forth with the publishers. But basically in that text, what he's trying to think about is, if America is this kind of experiment in political democracy, and the Soviet Union is this experiment in what he takes to be economic democracy, can there be a way of bringing those two together? It's also very significant for him that Russia had to also undergo a kind of project of emancipation vis-a-vis the serfs. And so he sees, it's a book, that later book is very much targeted at the Cold War and trying to, ease the kind of divided framework of the Cold War. But it's a very striking manuscript. But I think this sense that, Russia is a space of experimentation in democracy kind of drives him throughout the period from his early reactions to the Bolshevik Revolution up through the Cold War. I don't know, Jennifer, do you want to say anything about the studied blindness?
I mean, I guess the only thing to add about the studied blindness is, given that he saw the constellation of white supremacy and imperial capitalism as the problem of the world to be faced, he sought nodes of resistance against that in a lot of places, and sometimes had, as we've said, a studied blindness to their serious flaws. So he, in the case of the Soviet Union, was resistant to the idea that the Soviet Union had used force in its geographic expansion. And in the case of the Japanese Empire, which is the other kind of similar case, resisted for some time the idea that the Japanese imperial project was a racist one or a racial one, and argued that it was a form of uplift. He came to see the Japanese empire, he came to have a kind of paradigm shift in the way he looked at it. And instead of seeing Japan as the potential leader of the colored world, he saw it as yet another instance of capitalist empire. And that shifted his view. He never had that shift with the Soviet Union, because it wasn't a capitalist, although it was an empire in ways that he wasn't prepared to acknowledge.
Well, my friends, we are at 1928, according to my calendar, in the UK. Of course, actually, Adom's in California and Jennifer's in Paris, we should say. So this is just my very subjective time going on here. But where there are two brilliant questions that remain in the chat, but I hope that they're visible to the audience. They're good questions, but I feel it's very important that we should end on time. So thank you for those two questions at the end, which have to do with elites going beyond the color line, and also the sort of historical total compatibility, far from it being a tension or a contradiction between democracy and despotism, that actually the idea of republics and empires has a very deep history, and many people would regard it as a perfect marriage rather than, and then that's obviously a problem. So I think it just really remains for me to thank Jennifer and Adom for this conversation, and also for your completely brilliant volume. It is indispensable. It's gone straight on, certainly my reading list at King's College London, for Du Bois, and we're deeply grateful for this contribution. So thank you very much, and thank you all for coming.